Okay, so today what we are going to see, we will see a couple of interesting pointers. So let me make this slideshow. So yesterday we saw hands-on projects and understood the scopes of flow reference and HTTP request, how similar and different they are. And today we will see a couple of things related to HTTP request, and also we will have also another new connection that we will see. So with the HTTP request today, we will see how to pass dynamic query and URI parameters and headers to the HTTP request, and how to integrate external APIs, in our application. So let me directly, the project for this one is also in GitHub. Let me go to that part. So basically we are starting from here. Okay, let me move this down to here. So passing dynamic query parameters to an HTTP request, and you can get the project on GitHub, this dynamic query parameters request project. And by the way, when you get the projects from GitHub, and if you notice any issues, if it doesn't work for you, or any errors related to, it could be to the configuration or the data I pushed, if it is incomplete, please let me know. And also those of you who can and who have time, when you read the Google slides, if there are, if you want to make edits, you can just comment, and then we can modify it. There could be some errors, or if you think that a reading material should be added to this slide, and you found a good reading material, then we can add the link to that. So let's try to enhance it together, is what I am trying to say. And so there are lots of public APIs. Most APIs, to use them, you have to have a key. You request keys, or many of them also you have to pay, kind of thing. But there are lots of other APIs that are free. So in this class today, we are going to see how to integrate external APIs here in our application. And the link that I'm using is this link, which says free APIs, huge list of public APIs for testing. So you can just get lots of APIs on the internet. If you search, also you can get another repository of APIs. But anyway, for today's class, we just need, I'm using this one, the generalize.io, that predicts the gender of a person based on their name. Let me, by the way, increase the zoom level here. Okay. So we are going to use this one and this one in our application. We will integrate them both, and we will use an HTTP request. And so to understand, first we have to read the documentation, or we have to make sure we understand how the API works. Each API could be slightly different. I mean, we have to understand what are the requirements, how do I pass, does it need a query parameter or not, for example, and so on. These two APIs, you see the URL. So when we started with the MuleSoft class, I think it was in class, which one was this? 2B, we said the URL of an application is the HTTP request, which could be either HTTP or HTTPS here on the top. What is that one? Yeah, for some reason my cursor is not working. Anyway, okay, it seems this is different. Okay. So anyway, we need this one. So this is the URL of an application. We said there is an HTTP protocol, which could be HTTP or HTTPS, then the host, followed by colon, the port, and then base paths, which is, we said, optional, and we have subpaths, and we have to understand the URL of the application that we are consuming. And in these applications, they are very simple applications. They are not, we just need the URL. So they have provided the URLs here. And what I see here is there is, at the end, there is question mark followed by names equals to the name. Like here is Luke, and here is Nathanael. And if you remember from class 3b, that is a query parameter. So if you pass, like in this one, in the first one, in here, for example, we're discussing about using a weather API and specifying the city ID 10 and state Maryland, and we said query parameters, it starts with question mark, then we pass the key and equal sign the value. We can have one or more query parameters. This is one query parameter, and this is and %, and this is another query parameter. So as you can see here, name is we can pass name as a query parameter, or we can simply, this part, when we pass different names, this part will remain the same. This part doesn't change, right? What changes is only the name. So I can use concatenation, just take this as string up to here, just take it as string. Then the name that is passed as query parameter from Postman or from another application, that name save it as a variable or directly access it from the attributes.query parameters and concatenate it here. So that is what I have done. Let me open it and show you. First, let me make sure. I will take questions later, but first let me meet all of you for now. So dynamic query params, this application. So I have a listener here, get data, and we say the name, we are going to pass it as a query parameter. I'm creating a variable here. So the variable here is attributes.queryparams.name. So how we are going to pass it in Postman is, let me show you first. Take this, get data, come to Postman, and so name, for example, Philip. So this is how we are going to send it. So the name, this name here, we are saving it as a variable. We are saving it as a variable. For this simple application, we can just directly access it. Even in this application, as we can access it using the attributes.queryparams.name without creating a variable. But usually it is safe to create a variable because your attributes could change. The attributes could change as the mule event flows from one component to the other. So what we are doing here is we have just the scatter gather that we have been using. Then I have the first request, HTTP request, this one. Let me move this up. The HTTP request, as you can see, this string is the same. So I can just put it here as a string. Then double plus is concatenation. Then the name from here, since I have the name as a variable, I can access it using vars.name. If we have any variables, then they are contents, we said we access them using vars.the variable name. So when I pass a given name, for example, Fisaha, then this link will be just the same. It will be this one. The only thing is the name here will be Fisaha. So this is concatenation. I think this should be very easy. Creating a variable and then concatenation. The only thing you have to understand is when you are using an external application, you have to understand how it is configured. It is API and it's URL or other kinds of configurations. So that's what we are doing here for the generalize. And here for the nationalize also the same thing. This is the same, it doesn't change. And the name, I am adding it to here. And we said, if we use scatter gather, we can, in this case, we have two routers. We can have multiple routers, but scatter gather at the end, what it does is it returns an object, but that object is collection of all the mule events from each route. So the meal event from the first request, for example, in this case, and the meal event from the second request combined as an object. So in here, I am extracting only the information that I need. What am I doing? So payload is object. The object from the scatter gather is the payload, and then it has keys. It starts from 0 for the first route and 1 for the second route and so on. So I am accessing for the first route. When I do payload .0, it accesses the meal event from the first route. When I do payload .1, it accesses the meal event from the second route, but I need only the payload from each one of them. So as you can see, that is why I'm adding .payload at the end. So this way, I know the first one, it returns gender. So that's why I'm adding gender key here. So this is a gender key because I know this one is the first one, it is gender, and this one nationality. So that's what I am doing here. We can add a debugger to understand this concept. We have seen it before, but it doesn't hurt if we practice more here. Let me add loggers here and here, and also here. Then we'll understand it quickly. So add breakpoint, save it. Okay, so debug, and until this gets deployed, I can take one question related to this one. Let me unmute you, and if anybody has any questions related to this one, I can take questions.
I didn't see any configuration when you see, on the genderized and nationals.
Oh, okay. Their configurations, I just added the URL in this case. So from the configuration also, it creates a URL, right? So we say the configuration is HTTP protocol, followed by host, followed by port, and followed by base path, if there is, followed by path, and query parameters if there is a query parameter. All of this, it combines them to create a URL for you. That is what we did yesterday, for example, when we use a local flow, local application, a flow within the same application. But in this case, since it is simple, I just passed it in the URL. So let's finish this one, and I will get back to your question, and I will show you what we did yesterday. And also in the next one, we will have a case where we have specified the configuration. But in here, we didn't specify configuration. As you can see, we don't have any configuration here. This is empty because we just gave it the URL. And when you can give configuration also, it creates a URL for you here. See here, below configuration, there is a URL that it has created. That is what it does when you give it configuration. But now, since I gave it URL, it doesn't need configuration, is not a must. But in the next example, we will see configuration, both with external API and also with a flow within the same application. So here, let me send a request from Postman, and we'll see what the meal event looks like. Okay, so Philippe, send request. Okay, now we have one variable. By this time, now this should be at least clear to everyone. Well, since this variable component, set variable component has been executed, it has created a variable called Philippe. We didn't send any data. There is no payload. This payload is this one is not from this one. It is saved in Postman somewhere. Let me resume this and clear it. But let me start a new session so that I don't confuse you. Let me see now. Send. Okay. As you see, I don't have any payload. I don't have any payload now. This is, oh, it has passed the scatter gather. That is why I see an object here. Let me skip this and start over. Okay, this is what I sent the second time. So, okay, give me a second. Okay, yeah, here. So here, this is a second time, this is a second request. So what do we see? It is on the logger right now. As you can see, there is a dotted rectangle. It shows it is in here. So the set variable has been executed. I see a variable called the name here. I should not have any payload because I didn't send any payload. So the payload is empty. As you can see, the media type even itself here is just empty. So we don't have any payload. Now I will click next to understand what the next components are doing. Okay, so now it is in the scatter gather, the to request operations, and now it is in the logger, as you can see, after the scatter gather. And we say the scatter gather, it returns an object of the mule events from each route. So you see it is an object, and the keys are 0 for the first one, 1 for the second one, and their values are the whole mule event. And now I can click next, and this actually I can click next here. So in here, what we are doing is we are combining. Let me show you this. If I just click this evaluate data with expression x plus y equals question mark and paste it here, this one, yeah, I remember we faced this before also. How we resolved it, it was, let me, DW 2.0, output, JSON. Okay, so it is because it is in Java format that it was failing. So the first one, sorry, when I increase the size, it lost it. So the first one, as you can see here, this is the mid event from the first route. It contains everything, including the attributes. As you see, we have attributes, including the status code. Status code 200 means if it worked. We saw the different status codes in the beginning. So status code 200 means the request went successful. So status code and everything, it has attribute, and we have the payload. Payload also we see as a key here, and its value is here. So what we are doing is when we do payload dot 0 dot payload, it accesses this part. And when we do payload dot 1 dot payload, then it accesses the second part. Let me show you that one. So again, click this. So in here, if I change this to 1, it is going to show us the mid event from the second route. So it is here. If I scroll down, the payload is here. So payload dot 1 dot payload is going to return this path. Because the key here we are using is payload, so it will return everything in here, including up to here, the probability and everything. But as we said, if there is a scatter gather, it combines all of them and it returns as an object. So try to remember this. It's very important if you are preparing for certification, and generally also this is something very common that you should know. So spend some time on it and try to build an application yourself and debug it and understand it. So this is it. Now let me remove the loggers and the breakpointers and just send a couple of names and test it. before we move to the next part. Actually, we can just remove this, delete this also, get back to the design perspective. So now I can come, I sent Philip so for Philip it says, so this part is what it got from the first route. It is about gender. So the gender is from this genderize API. And this one is from the nationality API. So you see a key here, like this one, for example, you can understand that in the data can be very complex. We have a key, which is nationality, and its value is an object, as you can see, and that object itself can have an array. So name is a string, Philip, but country is an array. So under country array, what do we see? We have list of countries with their probabilities. Country ID, I think this is Sierra Leone. Maybe Philip is common in Sierra Leone. Country ID, I'm not sure, this is maybe Ghana. And country ID, this could be Kenya, and so on. So you can see how flexible the data is. And let's send a name that doesn't exist. Like if I do water, what does it return? Water is made in Taiwan, and oh my goodness, okay. So this is common name somewhere. What about air? Oh, actually this depends. We should not take it for granted. It depends how good the APIs are. If there is what is called garbage in, garbage out. So the data that the APIs use, if it is incorrect data or limited data, or the way they designed it, based on that, it should not necessarily. It could also give incorrect results. But you see, whatever name we put, it is returning an answer. I think these APIs are just bogus. Now, name none. Country. Oh yeah, I think these APIs are very good. Anyway, we saw how to integrate APIs in our applications. So before we move to the next part, I will take a couple of questions if you have. Does anybody have any questions here? Desalen, can you hear me? Did I unmute you?
Sure.
Okay. Okay, perfect. Okay, so this is clear, I hope. We can go to the next one. Okay. Close this project. Let me first stop it. Stop project. And close it. So I have a quiz that I want to see. Okay, in the slide is so this one is try to reproduce them. It is only when you build the hands-on project yourself that you understand it better. So I have another, before I get to this one, let's quickly see this one related to the question that was asked before also. Let's see how we specify the configuration. So I'll get back to yesterday's project. And so in the request here, we have configuration. You see, it has created in here below the configuration, it has created the URL for us. I didn't give it URL explicitly, but I gave it the configuration. I told it is in my computer localhost. I gave it the port, and also I gave it the paths. Then by combining all of this, it has created the URL below the configuration. If you have the URL also, you can just dump it here. So I hope that answers the question. We will see this one also in the next question. Close this one, and in here you can try this one. I don't have the step-by-step how to build it. I didn't include it in the Google slides because I want you to do it yourself, but we can quickly see it together. So what this one is saying is you give it a zip code and it gives you some information about the zip code. So I gave it, like, for example, zip code 20171. It told me it is in the actually this is explicitly I am using for US, but it tells me it is in Virginia and it gives me the latitude, longitude, and also the city name or area name. In this case, Herendon, it says. So let's quickly see this one, how I did it, and then you can do it your own way also. So you can see, as you can see, it is very simple one. So this is a path. We are used to this already. But in here, see, the question, it says, try to understand the URL. So the structure of the URL, which one is it in here? It is this one. This one. So in the URL, we have the zip code, not as a query parameter, but as a URI parameter. When you have URI parameters, in this one we saw in the third class, URI parameters, when we create them in the application, we create them using curly braces, but when we use them, we just pass it using simply, let me see, /, then the value of the URI parameter. Let me see where we have this one. For example, if you see this one, this URL, we have a query parameter. In the query parameter, which starts with question mark, is the state equals to Maryland, but we have also a URI parameter, and that URI parameter is 10. So when we create a URI parameter in Anypoint Studio, in the past we include it using curly braces. Within curly braces, we put like what that URI parameter is, and to access that URI parameter in here and create a variable, we just access it using attributes.uri params.zip code. We said query parameters are optional, but the URI parameters are not. If I don't give URI parameter to this one, for example, it is going to fail. So once I do that, in the request, if you see now I am using a configuration. So, and yesterday, when we were trying to understand the scope of request, we said variables and attributes, they don't get passed to a request operation. So we have to explicitly specify them in the request configuration. Otherwise, any variables and attributes you have before the request component, they will not be input to the request component by default if we don't add them here. So what am I doing here? Let me show you the configuration. The configuration, the host, for host, I simply put, so this is my host, I don't need the HTTPS. For host, I put the API this part .es up to here, and the path is ES. So okay, yeah. So this is my host. I didn't provide any port, and if you come here, then I pass the path. In the path, as you can see, I am putting US is my path, and it has a URI parameter, which is a zip code. Can also pass it in a slightly different way, but I am doing it like this. So I am passing, in the path, I am passing the path name and also URI parameter, but this URI parameter, it doesn't know it if I don't include it in the URI parameter. So here I'm defining a URI parameter here. This is very important, guys. Please pay attention here. And we have only 10 minutes to go for the break. So this zip code, I can't give it any other name also. It has to be the same name as the name shown here under name. But as far as they are the same, it should be the same because it will get it from here. So its key is this zip code. I can call it even here zip code. Let's call it zip code 2. And in here also this one, it has to be zip code 2. I mean the same key, because I am telling it there is a URI parameter, and the part of in the request, when I send the request here, when it sends to external API, the URI parameter, it is going to get it from here. And that URI parameter is vars.zip code, or vars whatever the variable name you have here is. You can give it whatever variable name you have here, but that one you have to explicitly specify it under the URI parameter, give it a name, any name here. That name, you have to make sure you are using it here. And its value, you pass it here. I can also pass it as attributes dot URI params dot zip code for now, for this case, because it's still the attributes will not be modified. The attributes that I send from Postman will not be modified. So this way, to request operation, we can send dynamic URI parameters, query parameters also. You give it a name here and its value. You can also give header. So this is how we pass dynamic query parameters, URI parameters, and headers. I think this one is very important concept. So let me take a couple of questions if you have any questions. Does anyone have any question here? Any question here? Okay, perfect. So we have 10 minutes. Let's go to the questions I have. Please, this one with your group, try to reproduce what I just showed you. Try to reproduce this one. So it says, make the zip code as the URI parameter, do that. And US will be your path. And yeah, so in here, this is your host. Let me change the color for this one. This is your host, and this is your path, and this is your URI param. Oh no, and this is your URI param. So perfect. Yeah, experiment with that like that. Now I have a couple of questions. First, I have this slide that is with questions. The first two we saw them before, but I added them here so that we can compare between flow reference and HTTP request. When the questions are, when you encounter the questions separately, it is like confusing. So I want you to see them together and compare and understand their differences. But before that, I have a hands-on demo here. I have pushed that to GitHub also. So let me close this. And that question is this one. So we have a request operation here. And this path is get employee info. It gets employee information. So from a database. Don't worry about the database for now. We'll start looking at this next week. But it gets information about an employee when I send some request. So there is a logger here. Because employee ID, I will send it as a query parameter. So I'm logging it here. And creating an ID, I'm calling it parent ID. The parent ID is the ID that was sent from as a query parameter. Then here I'm creating some dummy payload, some data here. Don't worry about it. It's just some data anyway. Now there is a request operation. This request operation, it requests this flow. And in this flow, I have a logger attributes.query params.id and child variable also here. This database, it takes that employee ID and gets this SQL code, gets the data from the database, transforms it to JSON, and returns it to the calling flow. So the first question here is, how do I pass the ID to the child flow? So let me show you just in the data itself. So I hope you have installed Workbench. If you have not yet, it is very important. So go over one of the exercises that I posted and install Workbench. So I have under this database, I have employee table. Don't worry about it for now. But anyway, this is a table. It is dummy table. So there is employee ID column. When I send employee ID, it should return information, the whole row about that ID is the idea. So that's what we are doing. But how should we pass it? Our ID from when we, let me write it in this one. Let me write it in Postman. So if I do like this, the pass is like this, and then ID, let's say 1 as a query parameter. So I'm passing ID equals to 1. So that ID, I am saving it here as an ID, and I'm creating some payload. This is just for the question purpose to make sure we understand it. Otherwise, it is not important with getting data from the database. Then there is request. So the first question I have is, what method shall I use in the request if I just want only to get data from the database? What should be the method here? Who can answer? Who can answer here?
I think it should be get.
Yes, for getting data, it should be get. So the method for this one, it should be the default method. So it is because I was experimenting with all of them that is supposed. But for getting data, it should be get if it is only getting data. And we said when we use get method, variables and payload don't get sent from the calling flow to the flow that is being called. So when we use get method, this payload will not go to the flow, to the lower flow, to the flow that is being called, to this one. And this variable also will not come to here. But we know we want the ID. We want the ID. We want to use the ID in our SQL code so that we can get information about that ID. Then how do we pass? How can we pass an ID from the upper flow in the request operation? Who can answer?
Using post, we can
using post, the ID as a payload, you mean? Yeah, we can create an ID, a payload of the ID and pass it as a payload. But however, request is for, we want to get data about the employee. So our method here, we said it should be get. And if it is get, a payload doesn't get sent to the flow that is being called. So the ID from the calling flow to the flow that is being called, rather we pass it using in the configuration the either of these. So since we are sending it using query parameter here, this query parameter, we can send it as a query parameter in the request also. We can send it as a query parameter to this one. So if you see here, see dynamic values, you can pass them here. I'm creating a query parameter in the request. I'm calling it ID, and its value is vars.parentID, which is this ID name. This ID name is, so the ID that was sent from Postman, I'm saving it as a variable, calling it parent ID, as you can see, attributes.queryParameters.id. So I'm saving it as a variable. From that variable, in the request configuration, from that variable, I'm creating a query parameter. If I don't explicitly define my query, add my query parameter here, query parameters in the calling flow will not be sent to the flow that is being called in the request operation. So that way, once I create a query parameter here, then that query parameter will come to here, to the listener in here, and I can create a variable from it, and I'm calling it child ID. So, and accessing it will be attributes.queryParameters.id. By the way, this ID name, I can call it a different thing also, like for example, a BC but I have to make sure that is the name I give it here. In here, the name here should be ABC. So here, Desalegn, can you summarize what you understood from here? What we are talking about from this question when we use get message to get employee ID from the database, and the employee ID we want to pass it from the main flow to the flow that is being called. Or who can summarize it? What I just said in your own understanding. Asqual, go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.
Sure.
If you want to if we use get method, we can pass the payload to the requested.
Right.
If we want to pass the payload, we use post.
Right.
We want to pass the parent ID, the variable,
Right.
to the requested flow. We should use we should pass it using their parameters by specifying it in terms of the request.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes. Thank you. So we can create here in the one of the group work here, in this group work that I was showing. In this one, we created a URI parameter. So when I say group work, somebody asked, so we have groups. We have groups of a couple of people. If you are if you joined it later, try to find out who the coordinators are, and they can add you to some of the groups, and then you will have meetings with them and discuss with them. So in here, we were passing a URI parameter, and that URI parameter, we are defining it here. We give it a name and we give its value. For this question, we are passing it as a query parameter. So you can give, it is the same whether it is header, query parameter, or URI parameter. The way you specify it is you give it a name and its value. That name, you use it to access the value. You use that name in here. So this one, since I called it, if you see query parameter ABC, when I come here, this one should be ABC. Because ID doesn't know it. It doesn't know. Attributes.queryparams.id is in the upper flow, but it is not here. It is not there in the lower flow because attributes don't get passed from the requesting flow to the flow being requested. But we can define them ourselves here. So this is with get method. However, if we want to send post method, if we want to send a payload from here to here, we have to use a post method, we said. And after the request operation is complete also, the variables in the main flow are accessible after the request operation, but the variables from the flow that was called are not accessible in the main flow. The other important thing to remember is the attributes from the flow that is being called come to the main flow, so the original attributes will be replaced or overwritten. So I have this one on GitHub. Try to understand this, experiment by changing the messages and so on. Now we will have break, and after the break we will go over these questions, discuss these questions. They are very important for someone preparing for certification. They have to expect a couple of questions about scopes of flow reference and HTTP request. And if you don't understand it for now, don't think it is complicated. You just need only to sit and run it in debug mode and understand. It is easy concept. It only needs time. So for now, let's have 10 minutes break. Okay, yeah, we will see that. So I read by the way, I read your the feedback you gave me. I understand that based on your background, your experience, the feedback is like on opposite ends of the spectrum. There are people who say, can you give us more classes? There are people who say it was too much, can you slow down? And so on and so on. So I'm trying to be somewhere in the middle and going step by step. I have also read someone who said I was just spoon feeding. I mean, it was easy for them. Probably they have good background, IT-related background, and other people were saying it was difficult. So it is kind of very difficult to harmonize all of this feedback. So I'm trying to be somewhere in the middle, but I will try to be as exhaustive as possible. We will see from end to end. Like for example, the books that Desalegn shared. He shared 3 books on Telegram. So we will cover all of the content there in greater detail. If you see the books, it is at a high level. So if you just build the applications, go over the Google slides I share in advance, and practice it in your free time and so on. By the time we end this class, you will have all the knowledge you need. And also, I will also bring people, MuleSoft developers working in different industries, and they will share their experience with us. But before we go to there, we have to first understand the basics. So that is, we are in the basics stage. Okay. So now we'll go to the questionnaires. This one we have seen it before. As I said, I brought this so that you see flow reference and HTTP request and compare them. So in here, what it is saying is a flow reference component sends a non-empty JSON object payload.
Okay,
let me mute the microphone.
Yeah, thank you. So
Okay. Unmute yourself, Dr. Fish.
okay, do you hear me, Desalegn?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So a flow reference component sends a non-empty JSON object payload to another flow named child flow, which returns an XML body. So the main flow before the flow reference, it has JSON payload. The child flow, it returns XML body. The flow reference component saves the payload returned from the child flow to its target attribute. If you see the target, if you just see target, it should remind you that it is being saved as a variable. So it will not overwrite your original payload. But if it says the configuration of the flow reference is default configuration, then the payload will come as a payload and overwrite the original payload. It means it will not be saved as a variable. So it says refer to the exhibit. What is true about the mule event's payload as the next event processor after the flow reference component. So the reason that I brought this is here you can replace flow reference by HTTP request. And the answers you get, I want to compare them. I want to understand it. So for this one, we say since we are saving it as a variable and as a target, we are calling it payload. Variable name payload here for target is a variable name. We can give it any variable name we want. And in the main flow later to access the payload from the child flow, we will use vars dot whatever name we give it. So the payload after the flow reference will be the original JSON object because it doesn't get overwritten from the payload coming from the child flow since it is being saved as a variable. We said in the previous, I think last week we saw this. Now let's go to the next question. This one, a Mule application has 2 flows named parent flow and the child flow. A variable is defined in parent flow. What is the scope of the variable when the parent flow calls child flow using a flow reference? So here also we can replace flow reference by HTTP request, and I want you to understand their differences. So we said when we use flow reference, the whole Mule event from the calling flow is accessible to the child flow, and the whole Mule event from the child flow is accessible to the main flow by default. So this is when we use flow reference. However, when we use HTTP request, it is not like that. So for this one, we said the variable is accessible in the server of the child flow. It can be changed if we use the same variable name. If we have, like yesterday, for example, we saw if we have a variable name called myvar in the calling flow, and another variable also in the child flow called myvar. The variable coming from the child flow, when it comes to the main flow, it will overwrite it. However, if we give it different variable names, we will have all the variables. It doesn't replace it. So the answer is this one. We discussed this also. Now let's go to HTTP request. What do we get here? A Mule application has a flow named parent flow. The parent flow consists an HTTP request operation at the end of the flow. The parent flow also contains a set variable operation right before the HTTP request. So there is a variable in the calling flow. What is the scope of the variable to the server receiving the HTTP request from the parent flow? The variable is not accessible in the server, it is accessible, it is immutable, and so on. So who can answer this question? Destalem, go ahead, please. Can you?
The answer should be the variable is not accessible in the server, since because it's already before the HTTP request.
Yes, right. So the variable in the parent flow in this case, it doesn't go to the child flow that we are requesting. If we want to send it to the flow that is being requested, we have to add it under the HTTP request configuration. We have to add it as a header, as a query parameter, or as a URI parameter. Otherwise, it doesn't get to the flow that is being requested. The other thing is, after the HTTP request gets data from the called or from the requested flow, the original variable is still there. So after the HTTP request also, variables that were there before the HTTP request in the main flow, after the HTTP request we will get them. But variables from the requested flow, they will not come to the main flow. Perfect. And next one. This one, a Mule application has two flows named parent flow and child flow. The child flow begins with an HTTP listener. A variable is defined as a parent flow. Then an HTTP request is made to child flow's HTTP listener with some header set. So there is some attributes basically. What is the scope of the variable? And the attributes in the parent flow after the child flow returns a response. About the variable, we said it is not the original variable stays there. So the variable in the main flow, it stays there. It doesn't go to the child flow, and it doesn't also get overwritten. So after the HTTP listener, the variable will get it. What about the attributes? What did we say? When we use HTTP request, what happens? What is the scope of the attributes? Who can answer this question? Okay, to give to. We have 2, 3 people. Okay, Salam. To be fair.
The answer is A. The attribute, all attributes to the child flow, remove or replace it.
Right. Yes. So the variable. So this question, pay attention. What it is saying is, after child flow returns a response, what's the scope of the original variables in the attributes? The variable, it is unchanged, so the variable is accessible as is. The attributes, however, since it is a request, that request will have to send a response, including the status and other details, and those details are the attributes. So the attributes coming from the HTTP request will override the original attributes. So all attributes passed to the child flow are removed or replaced because new attributes are coming from the request itself. So yeah, practice this questions by creating dummy projects, and that will help you to understand it. So now the new topic we are going to see is about, let me quickly show you this. Let's start from the top. We'll spend more time on asynchronous processing. So last time we saw async scope. We discussed about the difference between flow reference and async scope. We said flow reference is synchronous. That means in synchronous flow, a component has to wait until the previous component is complete. A component cannot get executed unless previous component is complete. Whereas in asynchronous, it doesn't necessarily have to wait previous components. And asynchronous processing has lots of applications, and we'll see in detail as we go forward also. But one that we are going to see today is about using the VM connector or virtual machine. And this is used to create asynchronous queues in our application. So what are these queues? We have transient and persistent queues. What are they? How are they similar? How are they different? When do we use which one? And so on. And what is even VM connector? What is it doing is what we are trying to understand here. Okay. So the project for this one also is under publish and subscribe in GitHub, as you can see. So VM connector, it says it is used for intra-app. Intra-app means within the same application. Within the same application, we can have multiple flows. So it is used for intra-app and inter-app communication. Within the same domain also, different applications, they can communicate using VM connector. So either transient or persistent asynchronous queues. So it is one of the asynchronous processing capabilities of MuleSoft. And what are transient and persistent? So when we say transient, the data is kept in memory, like in my laptop, for example. So there is what is called memory versus disk. So disk means if I save the data to the computer in a folder, then that data is persisted. It is written to my computer. So even if my computer restarts, if I turn it off, my data will be there. However, if it was just in memory, for example, you open some software and you load some data, now the software crashes, the data is lost because it was in memory. That is what is called transient in this case. So the data is kept in memory. So if it is in memory, it is fast, it is known, because it doesn't have to read it from disk. So it is faster. However, it could also get lost if your machine crashes or if it gets restarted. So that is transient queue. They are faster than persistent queue for that reason. Whereas persistent queue, they are more reliable, because even after the system crashes, if you restart it, then you have the data. You have the data persisted or in disk, so you will get it. However, since there is the disk I/O or what is called disk input output, since it has to read it from the machine, it takes more time, so it is slower. It is slower than transient queues. But what are queues? How do we use them? How are they used in API integration? Let's see. So for this particular case, there is a producer. Producer in this case means the application that sends the message. So that is called producer. That producer sends the data to a queue. It sends it to some location. So it gets there in the queue. It waits in the queue. So the producer, once it sends the data to the queue, it doesn't care. Just then the consumers, they can come and use it from the queue. So this is what queue means. A producer sends a message to the queue, then consumers consume it from there. So in real application, if you see, for example, let's say there is one parent company or one parent governmental organization, and under it has different branches. It has to distribute data to them regularly. Rather than synchronously sending data to each one of them, it sends the data to it sends the data to a queuing system, so it stays in the queue. Then the companies that need the data, they consume it in their convenient time. And the parent company once it sends the data to the queue, it should not wait. The application should not wait until the data is consumed by the consumers. So this is what it means when we say queue. And for that reason, it is asynchronous, because the producer doesn't wait until to continue to the next part of the application in the producer. It doesn't wait until the consumer consumes it. So some application is to transfer the message from one flow to another asynchronously. And the second bullet point, it says to distribute workload, or it is workload means distributing workload means if you have large volume of data that you are processing, then you distribute it across clusters. So different clusters, they take chunks of the work, and each one of them, they do part of it, and then at the end they return the result to the main to the coordinating computer. It is like you have a manager, and there are people working under him. He distributes work to them. They work on it. Each one of them, then they report their results back to their manager. Then the manager assembles the result from each one of them and reports to the manager of the manager, kind of thing. So it also can be used to communicate with different apps running in the same domain. We say this. So this is VM connector, and it has different components. If you see, go to Endpoint Studio. If you go to Endpoint Studio, let me close this. What is it? Okay. Understand. Okay. Some reason it is not working. I will open this and see if I can close the other one. Close it from here. Let's see it. Anyway, so let me show you in this flow how to add the VM connector. So as you can see here in this project, I don't have VM connector. The VM connector module, you add it by clicking Add Modules. If you click Add Modules, you see VM connector here. So you drag and drop it to here. And it has different operations. There is consume. It consumes what is in the queue. There is listener. It listens what is in the queue. This listener, VM listener and HTTP listener are different. Their configurations are also different. This listener, we have to explicitly tell it what queue to listen to. We tell it there is a queue called with this name, and listen to it. And if a new data comes to that listener, then consume it, kind of thing. The publish, it publishes. This is on the producer side. It publishes the message to a queue. There is publish consume also. This is one point, important point, guys. This one, pay attention. So we say VM, generally we use it for asynchronous processing, but publish consume is synchronous, because what it does is it publishes the data, but it waits until it gets consumed. And I have a question related to that. This question is common. So if you see in here, maybe let me decrease the spacing here so that you can read it. 1.5. So what it's saying is, what's the difference publish, consume, and publish is what this long sentence is saying in short. And the answer for this one is publish consume is synchronous, because it publishes and it waits until it gets consumed. So it is synchronous. Whereas publish is asynchronous. It publishes and it doesn't care about what happens after that. So these are the different components, and we want to understand them using hands-on examples. And the examples that I have prepared for you in this case is, let's say we have a simple application, we have some data, and we want 3 sister companies to consume it. Let's say the companies have their own applications. The first one here is this one, another application for the other company is this one, another one is this one. And what we are doing is, this is post, so it means I'm sending data to the producer. some data is coming from somewhere to the producer, and the producer, it is using scatter gather and publishing it to queues, and from the queues, each flow here are consuming the data from the queues. So let's take time and understand what is happening here in detail. So go to the slide, let's make sure I don't miss anything. Okay. The documentation I have added here, by the way, you can go over the documentation and understand what it is used for in greater detail. There is also a nice blog here. This blog is also good. For those of you who have time and who can read, I will add resources. Some of you said you got overwhelmed. Some of you said you want more content to read. So I will add more. I will add some content to read, but if you didn't get time, if you understand what the hands-on demos that I am including and go over the slides, if you understand that, if you don't read the articles also, it is fine. But if you read them, then you will widen your understanding. So the application we are building at the end is like this. On the left, we have the scatter gather. So this is a producer. This producer, it gets data from somewhere and it pushes it to 3 queues. We have Q1, Q2, and Q3. And on the right, we have 3 applications. Each one of them, they will consume the data from their respective queues and send the data to some system. For example, if we say the top right one, it could be sending the data to company S database, which could be in Google, for example. The second one, it could be inserting it to another database in Amazon. The third one, maybe it is saving it in AWS S3 based on the company's data infrastructure. So that is what we are doing. So let's understand it in detail here. So just once you bring in the VM connector to the scatter gather, I dragged and dropped consume operation. So here I have consume, and let's see. So let me show you the configuration and try to understand what we are doing. So this is a connector. It needs connector configuration. I click this one. It is like the HTTP listener configuration. I have added one already. Now I don't need to click add. I just show you. I just click edit. So it shows me here. So what have I done here? Let me increase this size. So what I have done here is I created queues, different queues. And then the publish, I will tell it to which queues it should publish. So you click edit in line here. Then I added 3 queue names, Q1, Q2, Q3. Once I added these queues, that is the configuration. Now I come here and the first queue, the first publish operation, I'm telling it to publish it to Q1. And if the data that was published, if it doesn't get consumed in 5 minutes, I'm telling it to just time out. The second publish, I'm telling it to publish to Q2. The third publish, I'm telling it to publish to Q3 because I have 3 consumers. So the producer, it publishes the data to 3 queues. That's what we have. So in here, we have a producer here. It sends the data to a queue or queues, and then consumer comes and consumes from that queue asynchronously. So once we do that, down here we have 3 flows with VM listener, not HTTP listener. This is VM listener. So if you see the difference between the configuration of HTTP listener and the VM listener, HTTP listener we have since lots of it. We specify the configuration. You see by specifying the path, the host in here, the host and the port and so on. Whereas if you come to the VM listener, which is this one, under VM, we have VM listener on the top right. if I click it here and see the configuration, the connector configuration, I just selected this one. I'm telling it from this configuration, and explicitly I tell it to which queue to listen to. So this listener, I'm telling it to listen to Q1. Listen from Q1. Q1, when it pushes data to the, when the producer sends data to Q1, get that data, do something with it. After this, like for example, once we start looking at databases, we will insert the data to databases. Once we reach about clouds, then we will send the data to the cloud and so on. So, but we are telling it, get the data from the queue. In this case, the first one is going to transform it to CSV and write it to CSV. This one that we saw before, just writing it to my disk, to my computer, and using append. So the first listener is doing that. But it could be any kind of operations here. Once it listens, once it gets the data, it could process from the queue, it could process it, and if it sees some unhealthy things, it can send email alerts or phone alerts, and so on. It is very versatile. The second one also here, I'm telling the second listener, the second VM listener, to listen to Q2, as you can see here. And the third one, I'm telling it to listen to Q3, get the payload, transform it to XML. We have seen this before. If you forget it, go over the slide. That's why we are including a root node and writing it to XML. So that's what we are doing. Each one of them each publish operation in the producer publishes TAQ, and each VM listener in the flows listens to respective queues. I have added loggers so that we can run it in debug and understand how it is working. The fact that it is also asynchronous. So let's run it in debug mode and try to understand it. Add breakpoint here and here is enough. And yeah, actually, since I have this logger, this could also be enough. I don't need to run it in debug mode. So let's understand what the message in each one of them is. So in the first logger here, I have before publish. I want to show you the sequence, what is printed in the console. So before publish is this logger, the first logger on the publisher. This one, the second logger on the publisher is data sent to queue. Then each one of them here have loggers. This one is consumer one. Let me make it consumer one. And the time when it got there. This one is consumer two and the time when it got there. We're using the now function. If you don't know, if you don't remember this, go over the slide this. And this one, consumer three. So we want to understand the sequence of operation. So save this. Did I save it also? Save this. And everything is saved now. So now I can run it. So as I said, what we are doing here is some data is coming to the producer. So the method in the HTTP listener is post. Then this producer is publishing it to queues. Think of this one when you say queues. The producer puts some data in some location and it doesn't wait there. And the consumer, it comes, checks the queue and a specific queue name. If there is new message in that queue, it consumes it. It takes it. It picks it. So this one is deployed. Let me clear it. So from Postman, we are going to send data, that means, because this is post method. And that data, we want to publish it to the queues. So I have Postman here, create. So what is the name here is send data content type. Let me close it. Is there content type by default? Close, restart it, restart Postman. Perfect, thank you. Yeah, so here, when we specify the header, just leave what is there, the default, change only the content type. So when we do like this, as you can see, we get a response. Now let's go to the console and understand the sequence of operation. Let me clear it and start over. Send. So if we come here, so we see here the first logger before publish, which is this one. Before publish is here. It publishes this one, printed that one. Then we have data sent to queue, which is this one. It has sent the data to queue. Then after that, so it is asynchronous. Just it publishes the data to here and skip it to this component. Then after this logger and after it sends the response back to the tool, we will see this logger, the other logger is printing messages to the console. So as you can see, this one, there is consumer 2. I mean, there is no any sequence in here. It could change from time to time. So we see consumer 2, and this time followed by consumer 1, followed by consumer 3. So before printing from the consumers, before printing logs from the consumers, it has finished the producer flow, the main flow, the upper flow. That's what we see here. Before publish is here, which is this one. Then after publishing is this one. Then we see logs coming from here, and so on. And if we send again, the sequence of these ones could be different. It should not necessarily be from top to down. So now if I send again, what do I see? I see now 1, 2, 3, but this one, before publish and data sent to queue, they get printed first. But this one is the asynchronous ones. There is no order. There is no strict order. And if we go to my folder here, you see I have data. It is each one of the listeners, they are writing the data to my computer. And as I said, this could be sending the data to databases or to other data lakes or data storage systems. And since I was using append, if I open this, I should get more than one object, and that is what we see here. Perfect. Anyone has any questions on this? I guess you have to practice it. And I have another question, by the way, related to this one. I have only 2 questions. They are easy ones. So we said publish consume is synchronous, whereas publish is asynchronous. This is the answer for this one. And I have another question here. So, okay. That question, what it says is, what can only be done with VM connectors and not with flow references in a single Mule application? So flow reference, we said flow reference is used for synchronous processing, whereas VM connectors can be used, mainly they are used for asynchronous processing, but the publish and the consume component is synchronous. So the answer for this one will be which bullet point?
B.
Yes, yeah, it allows a flow to pass events to another flow asynchronously. So asynchronous means a given component doesn't wait for previous components to complete. But if it is synchronous, like it is sequential, before previous component is complete, a given component doesn't get executed. Okay, perfect. Go over this project and practice it. And next time, starting next week, we are going to see how to integrate MuleSoft with databases. So if you go to the blog under this free MuleSoft training, if you go down, there is an assignment here. If you haven't done it yet, this one, week 6 assignment. I have added a couple of links here. This one you have to, it shows you this YouTube video, it shows you how to install MySQL and Workbench. It is very clearly explained. And the other one, it shows you how to install Postgres. These are databases. We will talk about, for those of you who don't know what databases are, we'll talk next time why we need them. Databases are data store. They are more secure, easier to manage, and to avoid data redundancy, security, scalability, and so on, rather than simply saving your data as text format, for example. So the reason we are installing two databases is we want to practice, for example, sending your data to two different destinations. If the data is some type, you may want to send it to one destination. If it is another type, you may want to send it to another destination. And also, in your application also, when you get data from somewhere, for some reason, your database could be down, so you should have a backup database. So you say, if this database works, get the data from that database. But if that database is down for some reason, get the data from this database. So it is that for that reason, we want to have two databases installed in our computers. Later on, we will use databases from Google, GCP, and Amazon, but now we are going to interact with database in our computers. Once you do that, once you install them, I have this video that I created some months back. So what it shows is about running some code in Workbench. You come to, like in Workbench, for example, you come here and you just copy paste the code and you run it. Then it creates this database and the tables for you. So I have different tables under the Northwind database, for example. You see, I have customer table, category table, employee. So this, if you think about one company, that company has that company can have employees. So this employee table is that, and employee territory is their location, their address. A company has different products, and it has sales orders, shipping information, and so on and so on. So this is dummy data, but it is good to learn SQL. So from this tutorial, you will learn SQL for those of you who don't know SQL already, and also we will see how to integrate it. It is very easy, and if SQL is new for you, in the meantime, you can go over W3C SQL tutorial. They explain it very nicely. SQL is like old English. So let me share this in the chat. Bookmark this, it is very important. We are going to go over these different functions and try to understand them, especially the ones that are relevant to MuleSoft. SQL is very common. In data analytics, it is the #1 tool used. Wherever we are, whether we are a business analyst, whether we are a data analyst, a data scientist, and so on, SQL is common. One reason is SQL can be integrated with other programming languages also, and it is easy. The part that can be done with SQL, we use SQL, and the parts that cannot be done with SQL, we do them using other programming languages. So I'm trying to say knowing SQL is really, really helpful. Let me show you, for example, some of my code, actual work code, and it is just SQL. It has lots of SQL code. So if I go here, okay, so in here there is a programming language called Spark, is what I'm using, or it is if you have heard Python, also the same thing. So I'm creating some functions, Python for Spark functions, but in the Spark itself, you can use SQL. So this is just the SQL commands that we are going to use. Basically, SQL starts with select and from and what to select, the columns and so on. We are going to see. Then once I do the SQL part, then comes the Spark part. The same way SQL can be integrated with all different programming languages. So when you work as a data analyst, data scientist, MuleSoft developer, applications engineer, and so on, if you know SQL, you will communicate with the team members more efficiently. So it is good to master SQL, and it is easy. So that is what we are going to start next week. And make sure you go over the exercise. Again, where was this exercise for week 6 to install the databases and create the database and the tables. And if you face any issues, ping me, and then I can ask other people to help you, like with the GitHub, for example. Those of you who successfully created the databases and inserted tables, you can help others who got stuck, so that we are all on the same page. And then we will focus on these SQL commands for a couple of classes. Probably 2 classes could be enough. And those of you who know SQL very well, even you can help me in the class. And then once we study SQL, then how do we send requests from from MuleSoft to databases is what we are going to see. So here, for example, I'm sending a request in this flow to the database to give me data about a given employee ID, how to get data from the database or to send data to the database. And also we will see what are the optimal approaches to insert data to the database when you have relatively smaller size data and a large volume of data. How do you parallelize it? When one of the databases is down, how do I get data from the other database, and so on. So it will be more fun. Please try to take it seriously and spend enough time.